Welcome to the meeting number 56 of the Standing Committee on Science and Research. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to take a few minutes, make a few comments for the benefits of witnesses and members. Please wait to open the fire door until committee's not on. Would be helpful, but other than that, please wait to be recognized by name before speaking. For those taking part by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. Interpretation for Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can also use the earpiece and select the desired channel. In accordance with the committee's routine motions concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informed that the committee, that everyone's logged in and tests have been done. Pursuant to Standing Orders 1083-I, and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, June 6, 2023, the committee commences its study for the use of federal government research and development grants, funds, and contributions by Canadian universities and research institutes and partnerships with entities connected to the People's Republic of China. It is now my pleasure to introduce, we have some witnesses that will provide a 5-minute presentation, and if you would watch your clock to make sure that you're within 5 minutes. When you're near the allotted time, if you're watching the screen, I'll try to get your attention to speed things up. So starting off via confidence, we have Jim Hinton from Intellectual Property Lawyer. Jim, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Honorable Chair and members of the Standing Committee on Science and Research. Thank you for inviting me to speak again with the committee, and my apologies for not being there in person with you today. I have been following the committee's great work and will share some additional comments that build off of the comments that I made earlier in June. For those that I have not met, I'm an IP lawyer, a patent agent, and a trademark agent with Own Innovation. I'm also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, where I study innovation and intellectual property policy. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario, and I am appearing before the committee today as an individual. It is clear that Canadian universities have had extensive ties with Chinese firms, as well as entities connected with the Chinese government and military. As we know, 50 Canadian universities have conducted extensive research with China's military since 2005, and Huawei has partnered with over 20 of Canada's research institutions. And while some Canadian universities have noted they will not be working with Huawei in the future, many partnerships continue and are ongoing. In preparation for this meeting, I discovered that as recently as a few weeks ago, there have been new patent applications published listing Huawei as owner with Canadian university researchers as inventors, including those from the University of Toronto, UBC, Queen's, Ottawa, McMaster, and Western. The filing dates for these patents go back to early 2022 and means that Canadian universities are still very actively building and transferring intellectual property to Huawei. This is despite the National Security Guidelines for Research Partnerships published by ICET in 2021. And while patents are crucial for extracting economic value from research that may be published, it is just the tip of the iceberg. It's not just the patents, it's confidential information on new areas of study, it's data, genomic data, health data, it's algorithms, it's artificial intelligence and software. But the universities are not sharing that information on what exactly has been transferred or to whom. I previously made 3 clear recommendations, and I will reiterate them here with additional context. The first is transparency. We need to know who is working with Canadian research institutions and how much they have been benefiting. We really don't know the extent of the relationships or its impacts. This information needs to be made available on an ongoing basis and certain aspects shared with the public. Where is the accountability? Who is responsible? The second is that we need to have proactive policies that universities must work with Canada's intelligence community to be able to be up to date on the latest intelligence and understand challenges to proactively manage relationships for Canada's benefit. This is not just a shared responsibility of the federal and provincial governments. The universities themselves must want to be higher performing and not just to appease public funders, but for their own relevance within the country. The current construct to guide change, a working group between universities and the federal government, is fatally flawed. It is insular. It fails to include domain experts that understand IP, national security, data sovereignty, and privacy, to name a few. In addition, the University Government Working Group does not include innovative Canadian firms. If we create policies that manage only the needs of government and the universities themselves, we can't expect that the innovative Canadian firms that actually commercialize technologies will be able to drive economic value of this research for Canada. Finally, we must retain strategic Canadian intellectual property and data assets. As I said in June of this year, we must stop doing these terrible deals and make sure we don't get into the same problem again. But with what I've seen so far, it hasn't been having the necessary impact. I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for keeping it within the 5 minutes. Now on to Ivana Koraskova. If I pronounced that wrong, please correct us. But thank you for being, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was close enough. Allow me to express my gratitude for this opportunity to address the committee. I represent the Association for International Affairs, a leading think tank from the Czech Republic. Our focus lies in scrutinizing the PRC's activities within Central and Eastern Europe, including in the realms of science, technology, and innovation. My purpose here today is to clarify the stance on trusted research in Europe and outline some measures undertaken by the EU and several of its member states to enhance their knowledge security. It's well within the purview of this esteemed committee that collaborative research efforts with China pose several challenges. First, in STI, China focuses on, among others, artificial intelligence, quantum, deep space exploration, new materials, neuroscience, and biotechnology. Given China's limitations in domestic production, despite its advancement in key technologies, it still seeks them abroad, utilizing both legitimate as well as gray zone means to acquire them. Second, as China strategically uses foreign technologies to boost its own technological base and enable domestic innovation, it increases the competitiveness of its industry and research sectors vis-à-vis foreign counterparts. Third, China has been clear that its ultimate goal is to substitute foreign technology with indigenous development and achieve dominance in key sectors across the board. This ambition has been coupled with a lack of reciprocity in allowing access to foreign institutions to the Chinese STI sector. Last, Chinese technology acquisition abroad is tied to modernization of its military, as many of the technologies are of a dual-use nature. By engaging in technology cooperation and transfer with Chinese counterparts, foreign research institutions may indirectly be supporting the growth of the Chinese military prowess. The EU has been gradually aware of these challenges. Yesterday, the European Commission revealed a list of 10 critical technologies, with 4 of them seen as more sensitive: advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum, and biotechnologies. These technologies were singled out based on criteria of the enabling and transformative nature of the technology, the risk of civil and military fusion, and the risk of misuse of the technology for human rights violations. The Commission recommends a collective risk assessment by the end of this year. Though the legislation is in the form of a recommendation only, and China is not specifically mentioned, it sends a strong signal that in the current geopolitical competition, the EU intends to actively participate rather than be a bystander. Despite the new push by the Commission, the sense of urgency and efficacy of adopted measures to mitigate risks of research collaboration with China substantially differ among EU member states. In Central and Eastern Europe, the awareness of the issue is still in a nascent phase. Our research conducted in Central Europe revealed that more than 800 research outputs received exclusive funding from the Chinese sources, including from the Thousand Talents Program and the Central Military Commission, a body overseeing the People's Liberation Army, and the cooperation has been constantly growing. In light of the interconnected global research landscape and the prevalence of international project consortia, safeguarding knowledge in individual countries as well as collaboration with allied nations assumes paramount significance. I would like to conclude with 5 recommendations, which may be also applicable in the Canadian context. First, it's important to address the elephant in the room. Most of the recommendations and guidelines published by various institutions globally adopt an actor-agnostic approach. However, China's global reach, far-reaching goals, increasingly revisionist agenda, and the nature of its political regime make it a risk and a challenge like no other. Moreover, it would help universities to comprehend the challenge more if the recommendations are actor-specific regarding the nature of the risks and areas that should be safeguarded. Second, drawing red lines may give universities and research centers clearer indications of potentially risky areas. Third, measures targeting universities and research centers have to be designed with the aim of bringing them on board as collaborative partners. In all processes, they should be supported by national administrations financially and also legally. Fourth, instead of appointing a security manager at each research center and university, one national contact point may be created, which would provide advice and issue recommendations. This system already works in the Netherlands, where it helps universities in due diligence. Last, Europe, as well as Canada and other like-minded countries, would have to ensure that they stay competitive. Especially in the field of emerging technologies, research funding needs to ensure that the most promising activities stay domestic. Thank you. I appreciate your esteemed committee's attention to this spreading matter, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that. Now to our final witness on this panel, we'll have Kevin Gamache for 5 minutes. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I appreciate this invitation to appear before the committee. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor and Chief Research Security Officer for the Texas A&M University System. I'll discuss the unique challenges of protecting cutting-edge technology and maintaining national security in academia's research environment. The Texas A&M University System is one of the United States' largest higher education systems, with an annual budget of $7.8 billion. Through a statewide network of 11 universities and 8 state agencies, the A&M system employs more than 26,000 faculty and staff members and educates more than 153,000 students annually. System-wide research and development expenditures exceed $1.1 billion, significantly driving our state's economy. One of the primary roles of academic institutions is the free and open generation and dissemination of knowledge. The U.S. research enterprise provides the foundation for a diverse and driven workforce and fosters discovery and innovation. International collaboration is critical to scientific advancement and the success of research institutions in the United States. American universities have become a magnet for students and researchers worldwide to join forces in solving our most pressing problems and promoting scientific advancement. Unfortunately, our technological leadership is under siege by governments of countries like Russia, China, Iran, and others, whose rules for information sharing and research integrity differ from ours. These governments are extracting intellectual capital, cutting-edge data, and specialized expertise at an unprecedented rate and risking our technological leadership. Academic sector entities must work closely with our federal partners to protect information and research with national security implications. In 2016, the A&M Systems Chancellor John Sharp recognized this growing threat and established the Research Security Office, or RSO, at the A&M system level. The RSO provides program management and oversight of all A&M system classified research, controlled unclassified programs, and export-controlled research. Understanding our collaborators is one of the most important aspects of any research security program. With whom are we collaborating? Who's funding these collaborators? Is there a foreign government nexus? What are the risks to the institution? Can these risks be mitigated? To answer these questions, the RSO has established a robust due diligence program through which we review all visiting scholars and postdoctoral researchers from countries of concern. In addition, we vet all personnel engaging in our most sensitive research programs. Our policies require mandatory disclosure of all foreign collaborations and approval of foreign travel. We conduct continuous network monitoring and have included keywords and signatures in our data loss prevention systems explicitly focused on identifying malign foreign influence in our research enterprise. We've updated system-wide conflict of interest and commitment policies and established processes for reviewing and approving foreign collaborations and agreements. We established a NIST 800-171 compliant secure computing enclave that is available to all members of the A&M system to protect our sensitive research funded by the federal government. Underpinning all of this work is a robust relationship with our federal partners, including the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and other members of the intelligence community. Collaborations between academia and the federal government are critical to addressing these threats. FBI Director Wray stated, "We can't arrest our way out of this problem." As the single point of contact within the A&M system, the RSO interacts daily with our DCSA and FBI partners. My office also maintains proper clearances, information sharing and collaboration capabilities, and secure facilities for meaningful engagement with our federal partners. Soon after the RSO was established, we created the Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Working Group, an association of university research professionals and their federal counterparts. ASCII exists to leverage the expertise of universities that have demonstrated excellence in research security programs to help address the threat foreign adversaries pose to U.S. academic institutions, and conducts international outreach to build a global dialogue and robust community of practice. We're actively engaged with the Canadian R15 in particular. The first Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Training Seminar was held in 2017 to provide a forum for universities to benchmark and share best practices from their respective programs. The seminar has grown since that first year to include the broader academic community and increased federal engagement. While the ASCII training seminar allows academic security
sorry there. We are over our time allotment there. There'll be an opportunity in the answers and the questions to hopefully bring out what you were about to say. And then I also like to remind all witnesses you can always do a written brief once you're done your testimony on any subject, or any matter on this subject that you think is relevant. So starting off our first 6 round of questionings, we have Gerald Soroka. Gerald, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses for coming today. I'll start off with Mr. Hinton. If the People's Republic of China were infringed on Canadian intellectual property, do you know of any remedies that those impacted could pursue? And does the federal government support pursuing international infringements on Canadian intellectual property?
That's a very good question. And so maybe to reiterate, the question is, what would happen if a Canadian company had their IP infringed in China, for example, by a Chinese firm? There are no resources within the country. The company would be left to its own devices to manage that. And I work with Canadian companies who have to manage that on an ongoing basis. And really, the expectation is that if you're working from a manufacturing perspective in China, that you will be copied, and really try not to give away so much information that if you were copied, that you would lose your economic advantage. And so there are no resources. There are things that are coming on, like the Innovation Asset Collective, the Patent Collective, IP Assist. But really, this is not from an infringement perspective or preventing foreign companies in China from copying or infringing IP.
And does the government recommend trying to go after them or not at all?
Well, there's no recommendations. It really is up to the company to determine whether it's in their financial interest to go after that. The Chinese system, patent system, IP system, continues to evolve. And there has been some successes, but it really is a very challenging task to be able to enforce IP within China.
Okay. Also, then, when we're dealing with international collaboration, such as research or academic institutions as well, does Canada have any laws on protecting IP or not?
Yeah, and so we have our domestic laws, the Patent Act, the Trademark Act, and then when it comes to international actors, they would apply. So if somebody's infringing the patent within the country, we have those, and they are generally parallel or harmonized with global rules.
You mentioned about Huawei there and partnering with 20 different Canadian research institutions. What are the repercussions of that in terms of our allies, such as, the Five Eyes partner? How do you think they view us?
Yeah, not very well. And so it was more than 5 years ago that the U.S. and Australia banned Huawei from the telecom networks. And since then, we've been continuing to feed the Huawei machine with intellectual property, hundreds of patents. It's not a very savvy move from a business perspective. And then when you layer on the national security issues that are presented, even more foolish. So we've got a lot of catching up to do, and this is not something that should surprise anybody. It was May 2018 that Huawei was revealed by the Globe and Mail to be systematically moving IP out of Canada. So it's been ongoing, and it's really, to me, only the public outcry that has reoriented the universities from continuing to do these deals, and not really their own understanding of the economic impacts as well as the national security impacts.
So, you did give recommendations, but I want to know about the steps we need to undertake to show our allies that Canada is taking this issue seriously. Could you give some parts on that as well?
Well, it's action. We have to do do what we say we're going to do, and when we say we're going to ban organizations like Huawei from our telecom infrastructure, we also need to be consistent and say, are we going to fund to the tune of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, and incentivize these same organizations to work with our universities and pull out the IP. And so we have to stop. We have to stop doing what we've been doing. And again, as I mentioned, I did a quick search, and there was patents filed and published September 21st, 2023. This is like weeks ago, coming out of institutions that I work with. I'm an alumni of U of T. I teach at Western. I was at Osgood, York University, teaching this term as well. I know these institutions well, but they're not reorienting, and they're not reorienting fast enough. And we have to both do that and signal that we're reorienting and prioritizing economic activity as well as national security activity.
Well, I know the minister was here on a different issue a few months ago and saying how they're really going to take steps, but are they actually doing enough? Or are they just dragging their heels? Or are they allowing universities to have their own policies in place?
Yeah, what concerns me is we think that no one told us not to do this is any way to manage billions of dollars in publicly funded research. Like this is Canada's economic future. Of Hannah said it best. Most promising opportunities need to remain domestic, and we're letting this go. It's not happening. The universities are not governing themselves properly. This is a governance failure at the university level. It's also a provincial and federal responsibility, and everybody's got to step up and say we need to do better. We need to reorient.
Yeah, so like in February, the government announced they're going to be doing all this, but they're really not responding as quickly as they need to be with how quickly technology is evolving, are they?
Yeah, technology and the geopolitics continues to shift. We see this with different countries. It's China, it's Russia, it's Iran, it's other countries, and so we need to be very dynamic. And universities move slow, government moves slow, and that's why I suggest that domain experts be involved that move quickly and understand how things have dynamically changed, like the groups that you have been as witnesses, but then also the innovators themselves. People on the ground that are commercializing technology understand how things change, how things shift, especially when it comes to things like artificial intelligence and data. And they need to be very closely a close ally and a resource when setting these policies and moving quickly to implement them.
Okay, that sounds like I don't have any more time.
Thank you so much for that, Gerald. Moving on to Ryan Turnbull for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here for this important study and for your testimony today. My understanding is that our government, unlike the Harper government, took research security very seriously. In June 2021, we put in place the pilot research security guidelines. We created a mechanism to assess applications through the Alliance program to protect Canadian researchers or institutions from risky partnerships. And I believe it's working. Last year, a series of decisions were made where, in partnership with public safety, to categorically reject all applications with Huawei. We also now know that we're working to expand on these guidelines and to capture the risks with any military entities. So from my perspective, our government's been very clear, and I think many of the post-secondary institutions are following suit or have taken that signal. So that's just a statement, but I wanted to get back to Mr. Gamache. Hope I said that last name right. You had mentioned the importance of research security officers, or the office that you suggested was playing a central role. And I just wondered whether, I note that our government in Budget 2022 made a commitment to Research Security Center and standing up that through public safety, made a budget commitment on that, and that's forthcoming, and that would be providing central support for researchers across the country. Could you share a couple of best practices from your RSO office that we might take into account when standing up that Research Security Center?
Okay. Can you hear me? I just lost the connection. Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yep, it's back now. Well, I'd like to say first that, I understand the strides that the Canadian government has made over the last 2 years in particular, some of the products that you've developed at the national level. And, to me, that they are very impressive because we haven't seen that same kind of activity here in the United States. In fact, we've taken some of the documents that you have developed and used them as models here. I've also been very impressed with, some of my colleagues at Canadian universities, particularly my colleague at the University of Toronto. Ultimately, I think that the best practices come down to what kind of due diligence program a university has. As I mentioned, we spend a lot of time trying to understand who we're collaborating with so that that our administration has the knowledge they need to make an informed risk-based decision. Everything is going to be based off of the quality of the due diligence that we do on individual collaborations and individual projects, and we devote a lot of time to that. I think the other thing that is very important is ultimately universities are going to have to solve this problem. And, some universities are farther along on the progression than others. We've been very successful here in the United States, especially with our academic security and counter-exploitation program, having universities that with great experience help those who don't have that much experience. And then ultimately, the problem's going to be solved by faculty buy-in. So we spend a lot of time developing individual relationships with faculty, helping them understand the risk to their intellectual capital and getting them to become part of the team.
Thank you. That's a really great response and fulsome. Maybe to Ms. Karaskova, if I could. You had mentioned an actor-agnostic approach and had talked about the risks and challenges, and you mentioned an actor-specific approach. I wanted to clarify with you that you're not advocating, as I understand it, to ban research entirely with certain countries. Are you, or did I mistake you for saying that?
No, not at all. I didn't mean it the way it probably came out. The problem here is that if you have actor agnostic recommendations, most of the universities simply do not comprehend them. Well, you are talking about some countries, some risks, some non-democratic actors, and the natural response from the universities and research centers is, so whom we should safeguard what exactly? So if you basically can't make the discussion about China, and most of the time it is about China, though we pretend it's not about China. Most of the time, if it is really about China, we have to say China is going after 15 critical technologies, and China is not shy about it. It's basically in all the documents, all the technologies which are listed for import are actually there. It's not just quantum computing, it's specific type of quantum, which is sought by China. So I do think that we have to probably go the balanced way, have actor agnostic approach, where we are talking about risks, no matter what kind of actor is posing them, but also talk very specifically about China as an actor which has very unique characteristics within the STI system. And no, I'm not an advocate for betting all the cooperation with China for a simple reason that in some areas, such as artificial intelligence, we are actually losing out. So if we want to have access to Chinese data, we would have to be more smart about how to get those data and how to cooperate and collaborate with China, but under our terms, to make sure that the research is protected from our side.
Thank you for that.
Just a reminder to some of our new committee members, when I do have the chair, I don't like cutting off anybody, especially witnesses, so I will give them a little bit of leeway to go a little bit long, but I will cut off members if they purposely use my generosity in that regard. Moving on to the next MP, we have from the bloc, Maxime Blanchette-Jones for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for joining us for this study. My first questions will be for Ms. Karaskova. You've proposed recommendations to the EU and European countries, and one of them is the creation of a contact point, a national independent one that would provide guidance to research institutions. And you've also mentioned that the Netherlands had set that up. Could you provide additional details on how that went, what improvements were made to security in research, and what benefits we can see in that measure, and what new structures there are?
Certainly. Well, the system is relatively new. It has been set up a couple of months ago, so it's still gathering the primary data. But there's obviously a learning pattern. So the first questions which came from scholars, also universities, high education institutions, were kind of a basic questions, and majority of them still was about China. Now there is a learning curve, so they ask very specific questions, especially about the due diligence to very specific matters. How it differs from other systems is that in some countries, such as in the Czech Republic, we decided to appoint a security manager in each and every university, which is financially kind of costly. The Netherlands went the other way, so they created just one single national contact point under the government, which has a link towards all the ministries which may be affected, and also it has a direct link to security services. In this regard, if an individual or an institution has a question, they can basically reach an answer, including the answer from security services, whether it's a good idea or not. The problematic point here is that the recommendations from the national contact point are still voluntary. So the university can decide that despite all the odds, they still want to proceed with the cooperation.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Karaskova. You've mentioned that it's voluntary from universities if there's a national contact center, as is the case in the Netherlands. Can you provide your opinion on Australia? They automatically ask that any collaboration done with foreign countries be reported directly to the government.
Not sure whether my response would be adequate because I'm not that familiar with the Australian system. However, I don't think that it may be probably not feasible from the sheer size of the cooperation, especially when it comes to some of the countries which are technologically advanced in those, let's say, 15 critical areas. So reporting each and every research cooperation to the government seems as a disproportionate measure, basically, to take. So what probably may be a better way to do is to focus on those crown jewels, which should be protected. But once again, the question is who is to define the crown jewels? And here we breach upon the autonomy of the universities, and the system, any system has to be balanced between the needs of the universities and the way how they don't want academic freedom to be taken out of them, and the needs of the national security, of course. And that's a very delicate matter.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Another question. In 2016, you started the MAP Influence and the China Observers in Eastern Europe, which focuses on studying influence in Central Europe. China's influence, of course. How has Chinese influence evolved over the past few years, according to you?
That's my favorite question. Thank you very much, but I can spend hours on that. So just very, very briefly, well, China entered Central and Eastern Europe more with 16+1 initiative in 2012. And over the period of the past 10, 11 years, we have seen China being much more skillful, I would say, in influencing various parts of the society. So it started originally with just reaching out to the governing party, then to the opposition parties, then to the opinion makers, then to journalists, for example, then to academia, and now to general public. So we do see China actually reaching all the levels of the society. And one thing which is the most worrisome probably is that it's no longer messaging to the local populations just the positive news about China, that China is a wonderful country. It's not trying just to spread the so-called positive energy. Now it actively works with those anti-government forces, the fringe political parties, the extreme right, extreme left. And that's something we have seen Russia doing in our particular region for quite some time. So I do see also a pattern of learning from one another. In this case, China learning from Russia how to influence more.
Merci, Madame Karaskova. Il nous reste peu.
Thank you, Ms. Karakova. We don't have much time left. I would like you to get straight to the point. Have you noticed more attention concerning security issues for research and intellectual property by universities and other institutions?
Just to clarify that I understood the question, you're asking me whether universities are taking up some measures against the influence. Yes. It varies in different countries. In my region, Central and Eastern Europe, I would say that Czech Republic is a forerunner in this effort, but it started only with a huge scandal we had with one of the oldest and most prestigious university, which had some of its activities funded by the Chinese embassy here in Prague, including classes on Belt and Road Initiative and profiling of students who later on were invited to China on fully funded trips. So after the scandal, the country started to move towards the right direction, but it's still very slow and nascent, I would say.
Thank you so much for that. Now, for the final member of Parliament for round of the questions for the NDP, we have Gord Johns. The floor is yours, Gord, for 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'll start with Mr. Gamache. Benjamin Fung, on behalf of the Alliance Canada-Hong Kong, he appeared before the committee on September 20th, 2023, and he described China's recruitment strategy as, quote, feed, trap, and kill. And it involves attracting targets by making lucrative offers and then making unreasonable requests, such as transferring intellectual property rights, getting sensitive data, or asking the professor to say something that might not be true. Mr. Gamache, can you speak about how familiar are you with this strategy, and maybe how do we combat these types of recruitment strategies? And if not, are researchers sufficiently aware of this type of threat, and how can we increase their awareness?
Okay. Well, I'd like to say that in my experience, there is a lot of naivete amongst the faculty. I have seen numerous cases of where substantial amounts of funding have been used to lure research from the U.S. to China in particular. As to and that would be the attract and capture part I've seen. I have not seen the kill portion of that analogy, but I do see very, very active recruitment in across the board, particularly in the hard sciences, engineering, and agriculture.
Of recruitment strategies and how can we increase their awareness?
Once again, I think it's engagement between our federal partners, our Research Security Office, and the faculty. This is something, a problem that is ripe for more effort in awareness. And I think we're just breaking the surface right now in that area.
Should establish a list of organizations that Canadian research institutions should avoid forming research partnerships with, such as, partnerships that would not be eligible for federal funding would be a way forward. Do you think that's a good approach, or, should such a list be made public or shared with universities, since there's, a risk that, the organizations listed will adopt concealment strategies?
The adoption of concealment strategies is certainly an issue. It becomes very much a case of whack-a-mole. But various lists, as you described, do exist in the United States. We have consolidated those lists here within the A&M system and use that as a tool, as an integral part of our due diligence process. So certainly, I think those kinds of lists, while they're potentially can lead to concealment, are also very valuable to guiding researchers to proper relationships.
Which do you think is better, a China-specific approach or a more broad approach, being aware of all the different threats?
I think the most effective approach is to focus on behavior. I think when you do that, ultimately one country is going to rise to the top. But really, I think what we need to be focusing on is those kinds of behavior that really compromise research relationships.
Ms. Karaskova, in your report, How to Do Trusted Research, you describe the findings of an online questionnaire of the experiences of researchers who have been funded, at least in part, by China. Quote, the survey revealed these researchers did not report any negative experience connected to cooperation with China, which also correlates with the positive perception of Chinese funding. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the research cooperation with China counterparts was not perceived as a potential risk by 65% of the respondents who filled in the questionnaires. You also cited respondents predominantly underlined the importance of previous positive experience with a Chinese partner and personal contacts or experience gained in China. They also highlighted that it has mainly been Chinese partners who initiated the research cooperation. Is that, is this the main problem, that our researchers are unaware of the threat posed by China, and how do we change this perception?
It's not just one of the problems. I think that it starts at home. So what the researchers actually cite is that they have a quick access to money, to funding, while then in the European Union, they have to apply constantly for grants with a very uncertain ending, whether they will get the grant or not. In China, it's relatively easy. The paperwork is even easier. So that's what one of the reasons they said, that it's over bureaucratized science applications that basically discourage them to even apply or to prefer Chinese funding from other sources of funding. Second is that China has all the infrastructure. They said that it's easy, it's convenient, it's very fast to receive basically everything they need. Third, they also cited, though they covered up, but I would just say it bluntly, they cited as one of the reasons that they don't have to deal with ethical issues, with ethical standards in science in China. So if they want to cooperate with Chinese partners, they will get very quick results without actually needing to have ethical boards consulted for various kind of experiments. So these are things which made China attractive for different collaborations. And last but not least, as Kevin said, it's also a great deal of naivety that they do focus just on their single science area, be it, experimental physics, and they basically do not see all those geopolitical implications. So once again, we will have to go individual by individual, and not necessarily directors, vice rectors, and deans, but actually the heads of laboratories and individual researchers to raise the awareness and perhaps to couple the carrots also with the sticks from our side. So it's not just about leveling the playing field in terms of providing better access to funding, but also to make them aware that there are consequences of cooperation with China sometimes.
Thank you so much for that. Now moving on to our 5-minute round. From the Conservatives, we have MP Soroka. Soroka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses again. I'll start off with Ms. Karaskova. In many of your articles, and even today, you spoke about how the economic cooperation between Europe and the People's Republic of China. I'm just curious, though, given that we now see in Canada the People's Republic of China political influence through our economy and now through our academic institutions and potentially even our electoral system, what do you think can be done to stop this intensive PRC influence across Canadian society?
Oh, that's a very broad question. So I will try to tackle it in those few minutes I have. Well, broadly, once again, I think we have to call spade a spade. That don't just hide it behind very vague statements, but be more open about what is actually problematic in Chinese influence or interference. Here I'm alluding a little bit towards what you mentioned, and that's the electoral interference into our systems. That probably more transparency, as Jim also mentioned, would be beneficial in this respect. So that's one thing. The other one is, of course, raising awareness as the second step based on more transparency from our side. And third is basically identifying the loopholes we have in the system, because China, but any other actor, is actually not creating the loopholes. These already exist within our societies, either within the societal divisions or through the lack of legislative actions, different loopholes in different areas.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you had more that you wish to put forward in writing, I'd be fine with that as well. I'm just curious, though, what you had mentioned about European governments are starting to put in place some policies. Do you think there's some of those policies that would benefit Canada at the same time?
I think it's more or less leaning in the same direction. Though the approaches may vary, though maybe coming back to this recommendation of the European Commission, it would have been probably more powerful if it's a different form of legislation, but it is actually moving in the same areas and also outlining the same areas which needs to be tackled, which are semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum biotech, and all the others. So, and one more thought perhaps on this is that none of the allied countries should be left out, because what China does and what our research also proved is that if it can't find technology in more technologically advanced country, it will focus on those loopholes. It will find country which has pockets of excellence in different research, but probably don't have that much of the safeguards.
Yeah, they're just looking for great opportunities. I will cede my remaining time to Mr. Lobb.
Thanks, Mr. Soroka. This question is for Mr. Hinton. last meeting we had, Dr. Chad Gaffield was here, and he represents the U15. I'm sure you're very familiar with him. He's a nice individual. I asked him some questions, and he said to me, I'll read his words, I think all of us today can feel very, very confident our research on campuses is being undertaken in a secure way that do not threaten us. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Hinton, do you think that's the way it is, or is there still some room for improvement?
Yeah, with due respect to the lobbyists that appeared before that meeting, I watched it intently. A very interesting response. Not enough is happening, and so from my perspective, from the public's perspective, the U15 universities in Canada were caught red-handed, sort of benefiting themselves at the expense of national security, and then have the gall to ask for more money and saying they're not getting enough. So, not impressed with what the group said. Acknowledging that there was a mistake and saying that they're going to correct them was probably the more appropriate response. But saying that everything is humming along well, to me, signals that there's still a failure of governance and leadership.
One last quick question, and this also surprised me a bit, because at the end of our conversation, basically the answer was, we're just going to, we leave it up to the granting agency and public safety, but there's really no check. There's no checks and balances, just all kind of on good hopes. What do you think about that?
Yeah, they for world-renowned academics, they continue to confuse science and research with innovation. Innovation is about economic use of science and research, and universities are not the ones that are extracting economic value from the research. It's firms that do that. And so they talk a lot about talent and talent creation, but that is just the starting point. There needs to be organizations, firms that receive that talent, generate intellectual property and commercialize and make money globally from that spot. And to sort of say that everything is working is not accurate.
Thank you so much for that. Now moving on to Valerie Bradford for the Liberals for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for freeing up time for this very important study. We really appreciate your input. So research security is obviously a very serious issue, and it needs to be addressed. However, I've heard of instances and worries of racism, discrimination, and bias towards researchers of Chinese origin as a result of some of the intense commentary on the issue. So for Dr. Gamache, what is the impact being had on the research community in this regard?
Well, certainly that can be an issue. Unfortunately, based upon what I have seen, the behavior that we're talking about today is being exhibited more by one country than by any other. And, that leads to an opportunity for somebody to make this an issue of racism or xenophobia. And that can have a chilling effect. I think it has had a chilling effect. But once again, I think that is all the more reason that we need to focus on the behavior rather than focus on countries, because this is a serious problem. Our research across the entire A&M system in 2021 demonstrated to us that the problematic collaborations, 80% of the problematic collaborations were coming from a single country. And those were just the statistical facts. And, I think because of that, it's easy to make it something that it isn't, and we need to focus on the behavior.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you comment on the harm that could be done if the issue isn't addressed in the right way? Like some people are calling for a complete ban on all research with China and Chinese researchers.
So, I think that the research enterprise is something very, very special. It is designed the way it is for a reason. It is based on free and open collaboration and exchange of ideas. It is based upon reciprocity. It's based upon transparency. And, my fear is that we have an adversary who has taken every strength of our research enterprise and turned it into a vulnerability. And we run the risk, if we don't handle this properly, of breaking a system that's very important to us. And that is my biggest fear. Along with that, certainly there is there's an opportunity to ruin careers if these sensitive issues aren't handled properly, to make it an issue of xenophobia where no xenophobia exists. Once again, I think we have to handle the solutions to these problems very, very carefully.
Thank you. So, Dr. Karaskova, you mentioned about 10 critical technologies that are enabling and transformative, and then the risk of misuse. What about evergreen entities and a list of sensitive areas of research that could be informed by the work being done by the EU Commission? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not particularly. So I do apologize. It's not specifically my area. So could you perhaps rephrase, or I would cease my time to others if they want to comment on that.
Oh, okay, I was just wondering if there are evergreen entities and if they could be listed, whether that would help inform some of the work that is being done by the EU Commission. Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, no thoughts on this one. Very happy to elaborate in my written testimony.
Okay. Okay, I guess my time's pretty much up, is it? Okay, yes, if you could maybe send us something in writing if you wanted to give that question a little more thought and research. Thank you.
I will.
Thank you kindly. Now moving on to our final 2.5-minute rounds. For the block, we have MP Blanchette. The floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will ask my question to Mr. Hinton. It's a pleasure to have him as a witness today. I heard you talk in your recommendations about more transparency, a better relationship with universities to ensure confidence, collaboration, trust, and education, of course, for the knowledge economy, how to protect it, how to benefit from it. You also talked about something important, leadership, bringing experts together to have the best practices, but also to have clear directives for national security and research. You're a university professor. The federal government in February of this year announced that it would be asking universities to respect a list of institutions that could no longer receive funding for collaboration. It was announced in February. We asked questions at the last study. There's still no list now in October. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Does that compromise collaboration that you would see in the university area? Thank you.
Yes, without clear guidelines and a clear list that's going to help guide researchers and who to work with and who not to work with is absolutely slowing things down and stifling opportunity research. We need to move quickly on this, and as Kevin aptly points out, there's a number of lists and there's places to start, and we're late to the party here, but there's a lot of other people that have already started dancing, and we can jump in time and continue on. So we don't need to build this from scratch.
Merci, Monsieur Hinton. J'aimerais vous en...
Thank you, Mr. Hinton. I'd like to hear, with your experience as a professor, there are provinces that haven't waited for directives from the federal government. They've decided to act to set up directives in their universities. From your point of view, will that be critical? Will universities have to ensure their own security if they don't have directives from the federal government?
Yeah, and we've seen that Alberta is a particular example. And Quebec, as you know, has Axelis and other programs that are working very closely with universities. A lot of this is provincial matter, and the provinces need to step up as well. But it is federal, provincial, and the universities. Like, everybody's got to be responsible, and it's my responsibility as somebody who sees this happening to not stay quiet about it. Like, it's only because of Sean Silkoff, Christine Dobby, and the others at the Globe and Mail, Bob Fife, and Steve Chase picked up on this story in May 2018 and before, and said, "Look, there's a lot going on. How come there's 13 Canadian universities that are systematically pulling IP out of the universities?" And at the same time, later that year, the two Michaels are detained for beginning over 1,019 days. So it's something that we need to be acutely aware of, and the provinces are integral to making sure that this is successful.
Thank you. Now moving on to our last 2.5 minute round for the NDP, we have MP Johns.
Thank you. I'm actually going to stay on that same thread with Mr. Hinton, because we've heard witnesses, say that we need to be on guard, not just against China, not just China, but many countries. In terms of ensuring the best way to ensure IP security, we talked about, can't just simply be lists of banned entities. My colleague just asked about that, but researchers should be given the training on how to spot security threats. Mr. Hint, can you talk about that, and who should lead in terms of ensuring that training takes place?
Yeah, and so there's a great program that began relatively recently, about a year ago, IP Ontario, and is working collaboratively. My friend Peter Cowan heads that initiative. And on the IP front, from an IP literacy front, working to improve IP literacy across the province, both within companies, but also at the institutions. And so a similar approach, working to build programming, building off of those best practices globally, that we have these great experts here, build off of those, customize it for Canada, and then deploy it. And really, I think the federal, provincial governments working collaboratively, as well as the universities, they do education better than anybody else in the country, right? And so who better to be involved with building education program than the institutions themselves that need to sort of learn more and be better aware of the issues.
Report and the Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship made in terms of their report, a threat to Canadian sovereignty. It quotes that the government of Canada explore the possibility of issuing security clearances for key individuals in the nonprofit sector, private sector, universities and research institutions to allow them to receive comprehensive briefings from Canada's security and intelligence agencies so that they can take appropriate steps to protect their intellectual property. Mr. Hinton, can you speak about what your thoughts are on that recommendation?
Yeah, and knowing CSIS and the great work that they do, a lot of the information today is really one way. They gather information and evidence, and then they pull that back. And so having some of the information come the other way, and share what and how to approach, and as Kevin pointed out, what are the behaviors to be on guard for, and how to manage that. And really, with a lot of the institutions that I work with, it's an inventor-owned policies, and the researchers themselves are left a lot of times to their own devices. So recognizing that, and then building programming and resources to be able to initiate that.
Thank you. And we are concluding our round of questioning, but as the chair, I will take the prerogative to ask one question of Mr. Hilton. You were talking about Huawei and the IP that was filed, that was taxpayers paid. And I just want to confirm the times, because we know that the two Michaels got picked up, I believe it was in late in 2018. And you're saying 4 years later, there was IP that was registered, that was taxpayers funded, that it would flow, any profits or protection of that patent would go to the benefit of China, not Canadian taxpayers. Is that correct?
From my understanding, that is absolutely correct. I have a patent in front of me here today that published in September of 2023. It lists Huawei Technologies Canada, and the governing council of the University of Toronto. I mentioned others. There are other examples. In many cases, and likely in this case, all of the commercial rights to this property, which were invented by Canadian academics and funded by Canadian academics, at least in part, are owned exclusively by Huawei. So if a Canadian company wanted to do what Canadian taxpayers paid for through the invention that happened at the University of Toronto and others, the other 19 research institutions, they would be legally prohibited from doing this under the patent. So we created a property and gave it to Huawei so they could sue us and prevent us from doing this. And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Just to clarify, like this technology, it's horrendous to think that the Canadian taxpayers paid for that, and it's going to be the benefits going to flow to the country. One follow-up question, and obviously it's Huawei, so it's communication, so it's technology that could be used against us, not just for financial gain for their country, but for espionage and other questionable uses of this technology. I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, and they relate to 5G, and so something that we have to use. I've got my cell phone here, and it's a 5G, and so I'm paying royalties under that patent license and standard essential patents to use that property again after having paid for it as a Canadian taxpayer. And so there's a problem there. And then when it gets into artificial intelligence and some of these technologies relate to that, of course, AI can be used for nefarious purposes. We've seen certain patents that have published with the automatic profiling of ethnic minorities. These things are very problematic, and the faster you can image somebody from a street camera and understand their ethnic profile, the more that can be
Mr.
used
Chair,
by in nefarious ways. Yeah.
We're losing a lot of time from the next study. If it was the same study, I may not be.
We'll endeavor. Just want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Apologize for cutting you off. And to other members, we like to hear the witnesses fully. I don't like cutting off MPs unless they are gaming the system to get more time in. So with that, we're going to conclude. We're going to conclude our panel. Thank you again, and we'll stand suspended and we'll set up the next panel. Thank you very much. Our second panel. Today we have three witnesses, and we're going to start with from the University of Manitoba, Dr. Susan Prentice. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to address your committee on pay inequity for systemically marginalized academics. I commend you for studying this issue, which persists despite decades of evidence. So to situate my comments, you may wish to know that I'm one of the 8 faculty who successfully launched a human rights complaint against inequity in the Canada Research Chairs Program, and that I have written and published about systemic discrimination in higher education. From 2016 to 19, I was co-chair of a University of Manitoba Joint Committee on Gender-Based Salary Differentials. And joining me is Dr. Tina Chen, the inaugural Vice Provost of Equity at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Chen was recently awarded the first ever Robbins Olivier Award for Excellence in Equity for a project on dismantling ableism and promoting equity for persons with disabilities through institutional action and accountability. And Dr. Chen was also a member of that joint U of M salary committee. So I want to talk a little bit about the history at our university, and I want to go back to 1994. So in 1994, prompted by demands of the Professors Union, the University of Manitoba studied pay gaps between male and female academics. A gap was found. A flat 2.84% pay increase to base salary was ordered for all women faculty. That award was paid out over 2 years, did not include any back pay, and made no pension corrections. Later, a group of me included, unfunded research team re-examined faculty pay. We found gaps. Our paper was published in 2011. It prompted pay fairness to become a bargaining demand in 2016 when the Joint Committee was struck. So I want to talk about this committee. Our committee's work was, regrettably, restricted only to women faculty, and we did not disaggregate our data. Our report was only on one axis of discrimination, and even that treated as a binary. These are real limitations, but let me tell you what we found nonetheless. Our 2019 report finds very different wage profiles for women and men in faculty and instructor ranks. Tests of significant statistical significance were deemed necessary, and our results did not prove statistically significant despite being highly suggestive. Our report did find statistically significant differentials in time to promotion to full professor, a full year and a half, a full 18 months between women and men. We learned that from year 12 onward, women were 15.5% less likely than men to hold the rank of full professor. While all women are less likely to be promoted to professor at year 12 and beyond, the lower likelihood is particularly pronounced at our medical campus, as well as in science and engineering. Our joint committee made 7 recommendations. Among them were annual salary scrutiny and a written report of such analyses at least every 5 years. We recommended study into career progression to understand why women are 15.5% less likely than men to be full professors at year 12. We recommended qualitative and survey research into male and female workloads, into women's slower career progress, into differences in employment past age 65, and other climate issues. We also recommended study into a different dimension of salary inequity, namely gaps in members' pension fund accounts, which of course affects lifelong earnings. And to my knowledge, none of our recommendations have been implemented. This very abbreviated history of sex-based differentials at our Prairie University holds some lessons. I will argue that our story is representative. Where salary gaps have been studied, the impetus is nearly universally because of the volunteer work of researchers, faculty caucuses, or unions rather than management. Regular monitoring is rarely implemented, and there is little accountability. Such ad hocery would be mitigated if there were more robust Statistics Canada reporting through the University and College Academic Staff System Survey. For this to be meaningful, institutions would require more internal attention and capacity to monitor equity data, likely through dedicated funds, including a dimension stream. So there are 2 key points I would ask you to take away. The first is that it's very clear that we need data for equity in order to take action. And this includes, importantly, data for faculty with disabilities, a group of our colleagues who are rarely tracked or reported for complex reasons you may ask me about. A way to track this data for equity could be to enhance compliance requirements through the Federal Contractors Compliance Program, through a strengthened Employment Equity Act and a stronger Pay Equity Act. A second key point is to underscore that under austerity, most Canadian universities have seen shifts in their ratios of tenure stream appointments and a rise in non-standard academic employment. Dubbed the precariat, these colleagues are disproportionately racialized and gendered. Such work exacerbates precarity for women, for Indigenous people, for two-spirited LGBT+, and for faculty with disabilities. Faculty renewal is essential in order to be able to offer meritorious colleagues fairness and full-time employment. I hope you are aware that national data tells us that those working in post-secondary but off the tenure track have grown by 500% in the last 20 years. And across Canada, full-time university student enrollment has grown by 18% from 2010 to 20, but full-time faculty numbers rose by just 6% in the same period. So with these takeaways, and in preparing us for a discussion, I'll conclude by underscoring that there is a fiction that the academy is a place of simple and pure merit, and that fiction goes a long way towards explaining historical resistance to grappling with documented histories of exclusion, marginalization, and systemic discrimination. Despite it being 2023, there remain demonstrable barriers to equitable faculty salaries for professors of different genders and from systemically marginalized groups. And your committee is in a position to make recommendations that can help change that.
Thank you so much. Next up from the University of Toronto, we have Dr. Boone. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps I should briefly introduce myself. I've been a faculty member at the University of Toronto since 1999. I served as the Dean of the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy from 2014 to 2018, and I currently serve as the Vice Provost for Faculty and Academic Life, and I've done so for the last 5 years. And in that role, I oversee faculty human resources matters, including faculty salaries at the university. So as noted by Susan, the issue of pay equity at universities in Canada and at peer institutions around the world has received significant study over the past decade and beyond. And we are happy to see the committee taking up this issue, and hopefully some of the findings that we are able to share will assist you in your deliberations. I provided for the committee a report from 2019 entitled The Report of the Provostial Advisory Group on Faculty Gender Pay Equity, and that outlines the rigorous approach that we've taken at the University of Toronto to address this issue. We developed a statistical model that allows us to identify the closest peer-to-peer comparisons of men and women faculty salaries, taking into account individual differences with respect to experience, field of study, and a few other relevant factors. Just for a little bit of context before I provide the results of that, at the University of Toronto, we have two primary categories of faculty that have permanent appointments, the tenure stream and the teaching stream. So with respect to the tenure stream, our analysis found differences in salaries of men and women and found that they were primarily explained by experience and field of study. After we controlled for experience and field of study, we also found that on average, our tenure and tenure stream women faculty at the university earned 1.3% less than comparably situated faculty who were men. Our analysis didn't find any significant differences between the salaries of men and women in our teaching stream. In response to this, effective July 1st, 2019, every woman faculty member who was tenured or in the tenure stream at the University of Toronto received a 1.3% increase to our base salary in order to compensate the difference that we found. I want to share a couple of key lessons that we learned in doing these analyses. First of all, two key variables dramatically impact salaries and thus need to be controlled for in any analysis: experience and field of study. So it's perhaps obvious to say that someone with 25 years of job experience is going to have a higher salary than someone with only 1 year of experience. And since newer faculty are more likely to be female at the university and more senior faculty are more likely to be male, you can't simply compare the mean salaries of all the men and all the women at the university, because that confounds gender and experience. So any analysis of salary equity must control for this. Similarly, we must control for fields of study because there are significant differences in salaries across different fields of study. So, for example, fields of management or law have higher salaries for faculty members than other fields of study due primarily to market forces, which are at least partially driven by the fact that these faculty members could earn higher salaries in the private sector. As Susan noted, we believe it's really important to review any salary analysis periodically. And at the University of Toronto, we have committed to doing this review every 5 years. We are currently in the process of redoing our analysis to see if the changes that we made back in 2019 are holding. And I don't have the results yet, but the preliminary analysis suggests that we do not currently have any differences in pay for faculty who are men and faculty who are women once we control for experience in field of study. We will be making this report public as soon as it is completed. A couple of other things I wanted to note, and that is that any gender pay equity strategy needs to consider a range of things. And one of those things is thinking about diversity in hiring. So at the university currently, about half of all new hires in both our tenure and our teaching stream at the University of Toronto are women. And we need to keep monitoring that to ensure that we are thinking very carefully about who we're hiring. We also need to think about when we hire new people, how we pay their starting salaries. So at the University of Toronto, all new hires are approved centrally and their salaries are approved centrally based on an analysis of the rank at which they're being hired at, the time since highest degree, which is a proxy for experience, and field of study. We've engaged hundreds of faculty members and administrators who are involved in hiring or career review discussions, in unconscious bias training, workshops, and discussions. These evidence-based, faculty-led discussions have been vital in helping keep issues of equity top of mind across the university to ensure that the equity pay gap does not reemerge now that we have rectified it. And I hope some of these lessons learned from our work are helpful in your ongoing deliberations of this matter.
Thank you so much for the testimony. And now for our first round of questioning, we have from the Conservatives, MP Michelle Rempel-Gardner for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll start with Dr. Prentice. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a chance to expound on your recommendation for better data. Do you have a more precise recommendation that the committee could consider in terms of where that data gathering might fall within the federal government's purview?
Thank you for the question and for the chance to clarify. I do think that if under an enhanced federal contractor program, universities were required to report more robustly, they would need to internally track the kind of data that would allow them to report to the federal government. So I think that is one mechanism under your direct control. I also think that's probably the biggest and most important one. The other one could be
if I may, so you're suggesting that like universities would put together a better or standardized tracking system that would be reported with what mechanism, with like tri-council funding, or what would it be attached to in terms of federal government purview?
Right. Well, the federal contractors program used to ask for any university that did more than $200,000 worth of business with the federal government to make a report. It's been, the threshold's gone up over the years. But through that requirement, there was a mechanism by which there was accountability outside of the university. One of the pressure points that I think needs to be strengthened is institutional autonomy needs respecting, but there also needs to be accountability. So universities themselves, if required to report externally, will pay more attention internally.
Got it.
And that's where I think the federal contractor program could be a tool in helping to mitigate pay inequity.
Thank you to Dr. Chen. And I'm enjoying questioning the leaders of my alma mater. So there's that. Dr. Chen, so part of what we're trying to determine in this committee is what sort of recommendations could we use that are within federal jurisdiction, because a lot of the issues that have been raised before us, they seem to be more institutional based or embedded within the provincial government. So I appreciate, for example, what Dr. Prentice just said. Some of the matters that you raised, I'm just wondering, like, again, are there specific action items within the federal government purview that don't necessarily blur the lines between those jurisdictions? For example, the current Quebec education minister had raised some concerns about the DEI standards with Canada research chairs, and that being a bit of incursion into provincial jurisdiction. What sort of recommendations would you have for the committee to perhaps narrow that scope and avoid that sort of a pratfall?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think here, when we're talking about data collection and thinking about the federal scope, I really would encourage everyone to be thinking about the way that StatsCan, disaggregated data action plan, should be implemented nationwide and in the types of collection of data. So the disaggregated action data plan really is calling on us not only to move beyond gender-based or just sex data, but really as we think about where are we looking to identify systemic inequities, and then we're using that then to track the ways in which we work to narrow those inequities. And so I think really applying within all areas, including through post-secondary, an expectation that we're working in accordance with that disaggregated data action plan, I think is a key part. I'm also really looking forward to some of us hearing the results of what UCAS has done as their pilot study. And this is the use of the human resources data, but trying to create a kind of more unified form. Now, this is one of the issues where there's an expectation or a sense that perhaps we'd be collecting the data around equity, diversity, inclusion, demographic data in a kind of consistent manner. I'm not really sure if all those who signed up as part of Dimensions and I have actually followed through on that, if they're collecting the same way, but I think this is another way of bridging together what are the national initiatives, things that are happening at the federal level with what's happening locally. And in the other realm, I would say really thinking about administrative data. So how do we actually make those links to administrative data, much in like the health realms? And so how do we think about joining the systems so that we're also not thinking about survey fatigue?
No, that's very helpful. Again, other points that have sort of stuck with me throughout the committee study have been Dr. Smith-Carrier state that men's earnings rise significantly with academic productivity, whereas women's do not. Perhaps I'll ask both VP levels at the University of Toronto as well as the University of Manitoba. Is this a statement that still resonates within the data that you have at your institutions? I'll go start with the U of T, the center of the universe for Western Canadians.
Not the center of the universe, but I will say that our analysis doesn't show that at the moment. The analysis that we did quite clearly shows that we don't have a greater we no longer have a difference between men and women's salaries at the university, and the difference we did find in 2019 was quite small. So I don't think it.
And I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. Is intellectual property ownership and technology commercialization factored into the conversation of gender pay gaps in terms of what you're aware of? And perhaps I'll go back to my colleague at the University of Manitoba in terms of her new role as a DEI lead and whether or not that's something that you've thought about.
We're going to have to ask for that in written. We're over time on that one. Now to the Liberal Party for MP Jazik, and I'd like to remind all members to have their mics turned off when they're not asking questions in the room. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our three witnesses for all the work you've been doing on this very important question through the years. I'm relatively new to this committee, and I think it was Dr. Chen, you referenced the Dimensions Initiative. As I understand, this was administered by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, NSERC, for the three federal granting agencies. And obviously it was a handbook to try to help post-secondary institutions to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion in their environments. I think, Dr. Chen, you made reference to this particular initiative and talked about renewing it. And perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit as to what the federal government could do, in your view, to improve this existing initiative.
Well, I think it's. I thank you for that question and for bringing us back to that. And I'm particularly interested in what was launched just last year in the trying to think through what it would mean to modernize the university and college academic staff survey, particularly thinking about EDI and the inclusion of part-time faculty or part-time instructors. And I think Dr. Prentice already spoke to how that's actually a big part of the pay equity considerations at the moment. And in order to lead this, we really need to be done nationally. The pilot that was launched to try and include this, to think about what that would mean, I think will yield for us a number of considerations as we look across the nation. And we know that as we're hiring, our salaries are not only driven by what's happening within our institutions, but obviously in relation to each other. And so to make sure that continues to be funded. I think alongside here, we know that Dimensions and certainly the StatsCan work that we all rely upon in this is also dependent on the long form census, that we're asking extensive questions, that we're funding the labor surveys, that we're doing all of that work. And so I think the funding and the ways that, particularly over the last 2 decades, sometimes programs have been pulled back and then they are reintroduced. This really creates barriers to that kind of robust data that's necessary for us then to locate the specific institutional responses. And so I'll stop there. I think the others probably think quite a bit about dimensions as well, so they may have other input.
Thank you so much. I am intrigued by the Federal Contractors Program, and we did receive a submission from the Canadian Association of University Teachers dated just this September 2023, and the recommendation there is to strengthen the Federal Contractors Program. So could you perhaps, Dr. Prentice, perhaps you could just be very specific as to what you would like to see in terms of strengthening that federal contractors program?
Mm-hmm. So this is a long-standing program of the federal government. I think it dates nearly 3 decades now. Under the federal contractors program, any university which has a contract with the federal government, which is the way most of us through Tri-Council and other grants fund our research, and through which many universities find other operating streams, we're required to report. And one of the requirements for reporting began with gender disaggregated data, but it could and should, I would say, be strengthened so that it includes other axes of inequity. What this will require is that in order for universities to meet reporting requirements and the kind of accountability that comes from external scrutiny, it pushes, it nudges, it coaxes behavior inside universities that is equity enhancing. So the threshold was increased to too high. I think at one point it was 200,000. It's now up to over 1 million on each one. So the threshold could come down. The CAUT probably has a closer handle on how this operates nationally. But I'm aware that at the University of Manitoba, historically, some of the women's groups on campus had to go to the federal contractors compliance reports to learn about what was happening inside of our own universities. So the creation of data for equity has a very positive cascade of effects that can allow other people to use it.
Thank you. There was a third recommendation in this submission, it's worded this way: facilitate the renewal of faculty. And perhaps, Dr. Boone, you could address this particular area and elaborate a little bit more on what precisely the recommendation would mean for the federal government.
Sure. As I mentioned, we've been thinking a lot about this when we do have the opportunity to hire, ensuring that we are doing searches which are targeted at encouraging the widest range of people applying, making sure that we are tracking who is successful in our searches, and thinking a lot about are there any unconscious biases creeping into our processes to do our best to ensure that we're being open and welcoming to all. As we look at who we're bringing into our community, we know, as I mentioned earlier, that in the last 15 years or so, we've almost reached gender parity with respect to the women and men at the assistant and the associate professor ranks. So that reflects hiring over the last 15 years or so. And in the last few years that I've been in this role and looking at who we're hiring each year, we know that we are hiring about 50%, sometimes slightly over that, women each year into our continuing tenure stream and teaching stream positions. We are also thinking a lot about other axes of diversity and enacting programs to ensure that we are welcoming and hiring a wide range of faculty. So those are, I think, all things that are really, really important as part of any program in this space.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now on to the block for 6 minutes. Maxine, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for joining us for this study. My first question will be for Ms. Chen. As you know, pay equity and university administration is Quebec and the province's jurisdiction in large part. Some federal programs address equity through imposing diversity and equity and inclusion criteria, but don't necessarily address pay equity specifically. Could we concentrate on what falls under the federal government's responsibility, like the Federal Contractors Program, the Tri-Council, the research chairs? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. We recognize equity for people who are in underrepresented groups, but are there really mechanisms to ensure pay equity in programs that are under federal jurisdiction?
Well, I think, thank you for your question. And I think here that when we're talking about pay equity, that we are thinking about the various ways in which compensation happens in these fields. And so that when we can think about those programs, whether it's through the Canada Research Chairs program, it's through some of the granting councils, when we think through those as well, there are not, to my knowledge, many studies that look at what are the kind of gender inequities and the types of awards that are being made. But what we do know from research is that there are, in fact, discrepancies and inequities in what people will ask for in their research asks, so that particularly those who are systemically marginalized do not ask for the biggest sums of money. They don't go after the biggest grants. If they tell you it's a $300,000 to $500,000 ask, many will ask for what they think is the minimum necessary to do it, and they will proceed to do that work. Whereas those who situate themselves in places of privilege will often ask for more. They'll go to the maximum amount. And I think in light of the previous question, given the way that many institutions operate, they start to talk about the value, they talk about merit pay, they give rewards to people based on often the number of the dollars that come in. I think there are ways that ensuring or studying and making us more aware of the ways that inequities are reflected, not just in how many awards are given out, but particularly across fields, the ways that they're valued, whether, in moving many of the practices out of the Canada Research Chairs program and thinking more about how does that go across all of the Tri-Council funding as well. These would be really significant steps, because the pay equity and the types of ways that inequities are experienced in the workplace at the post-secondaries is not just about the take-home salaries that are paid by the institutions, but it's actually the ways in which the work conditions get framed. And so I think that's an important way to also begin to think about some of those issues in terms of what's under the control of the federal.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jen. Now I'll turn to Ms. Boone. If I rephrase my question, what is part of federal programs? From your point of view, are there requirements that ensure that there's pay equity or for the genders and diverse people? So when the federal government provides funding for research chairs under the 3 organizations or the Federal Contractors Program, are there mechanisms in place from your point of view to ensure equity?
Well, as Susan mentioned, certainly with the Contractors Program, we do reporting, and same with some of the chairs programs. I think I'm trying to think creatively about other things that are under the federal government's control. And one of those would be the salaries of graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, young researchers, because part of the challenge is we don't have as many women and diverse individuals in the pipeline as we would like to hire. And I do think that's under the federal government's control. And if we can encourage women and others to engage early and remain engaged in scientific and research pursuits, I think we can work together to build that pipeline of scholars across a wide range of fields. So that's something else that I think the federal government could seriously make an impact in.
Merci, Madame Boone.
Thank you, Ms. Boone. I'll turn to Professor Prentice. Do you have anything to add on the requirements in place? What could the federal government improve to ensure better pay equity and for equity for professors?
Merci de votre question.
Thank you for your question. To be better understood, I will answer in English.
The actual allocation of awards is one of the most important things the federal government can do. And I feel very proud to have been part of a very long fight to ensure that there is not a leaky pipeline in the awarding of Canada Research Chairs, for example, so that women and men get their fair share, so that persons of racialized peoples get their share, Indigenous and colleagues with disabilities. The disability data is less available, and Tina perhaps will be able to speak to that. So it's true that directly speaking, once a chair is appointed, it's up to the individual institution, for example, to set the salaries. But the awarding of the awards, it certainly falls within the ability of the federal government to influence. And I think, in fact, it's a completely appropriate policy that universities that fail to meet equity and diversity targets will find their future chairs are withheld until they can meet the objectives. I think that's an appropriate mechanism for the federal government, despite the controversy it's raised in Quebec. The larger question, of course, is that we're trying to find a light hand that both recognizes institutional autonomy and a federal interest in equity. And these are where some of these intermediate mechanisms of data and reporting go a long way to helping both parties build more fairness.
Thank you so much for that. Now on to the last round for MP Johns. The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you all for your really important testimony. Maybe Dr. Boone, you can help me with this. One-time pay adjustments are sometimes given to faculty to address inequity at several, higher learning institutions, universities. However, it's also seen as a Band-Aid rather than a real solution. How can institutions meaningfully address pay inequities that they identify between their faculty?
Thanks for that question. So you're absolutely right. If we don't get to the bottom of the issue, why is the pay equity there in the first place, then we haven't corrected the problems. And so that's why I said it has to be fixing the problem. It has to be part of a broader strategy that includes thinking very deeply about unconscious bias throughout the system. We look at, for example, starting salaries to ensure that with new hires, we're not recreating a problem. We need to look at other points, for example, merit assessment, promotion, tenure, all of those things. Susan mentioned some of this as well, to identify whether in any of those academic review processes, we also have bias. We need to think about what we mean by excellence and merit in academic settings, and be conscious that there are many different ways that one can demonstrate excellence. And so that's something, this concept of unconscious bias and starting a dialogue, maintaining a dialogue that is based on the evidence, and there's a lot of evidence in the literature about what some of these biases are, bringing them to the forefront and catalyzing regular conversations across the faculty and for all those involved in making these decisions along one's career path. That's the way ultimately to ensure that we're not recreating a problem over time. And then obviously assessing regularly. I think Susan mentioned that as well. You have to keep redoing this analysis to check.
Okay, I want to go beyond, expand on the lack of data. Maybe Dr. Prentice, you can help. You talked about StatsCan, being an important role in that capacity. But maybe you can talk about what institutions' role should also play.
Well, my employer is the University of Manitoba, so they're the ones that set my salary. I'm lucky to have a union. So we're professors who are unionized. So the union has a role in this too, in bargaining for equity. I'll use my own career as an example. I got hired in 1993, so I got part of that 2.84% I talked about back in the early 90s. I've made 2 individual anomaly awards, which both have been successful. And I still have pay inequity, but not statistically significant compared to some of my male colleagues. So this is clearly on my institution. But if these data are required to be reported, if they need to be made accessible and transparent, if they're presented in disaggregated ways, they provide the kind of evidence and fuels that allow actors on their own campuses to pick them up and to push their own institutions. One of the things I said, and I think it's true, to my knowledge, every time there has been a study that has looked at inequity in pay, it has been led by those who have been affected by it. It does not primarily start from the top. So if Heather's been able to implement that at the University of Toronto, then hats off to you. Almost always this is done by people who are seeking to end the unfairness, so that's where they start.
Thank you. In the equity myth, racialization and ingenuity at Canadian universities by Francis Henry et al., the authors write that generally speaking, more racialized faculty perceive that tenure and promotion are based on soft metrics rather than hard metrics like publications or winning grants. The opposite pattern is largely found with perceptions about administrative and committee appointments and hiring consistently across all measures of perceptions. Fewer racialized faculty agreed that equity considerations are a factor affecting tenure, promotion, administration, and committee appointments and hiring. Beyond pay, how does inequity affect the experiences of faculty at Canadian universities, including tenure, promotion, appointments, and hiring? Maybe you can answer that as well, Ms. Prentice.
Well, thank you. So at my university, for example, my job says 40% of my time is teaching, 40% of my time is research, and 20% of my time is service. I don't think this is always understood outside the academy, that professors' jobs are very rich and complex. But for example, when it comes time to promotion to full professor at my university, a person's service dossier will not be taken into account. In my faculty, we only look at teaching and at publications. So even though 20% of faculty time is supposed to be spent on service, which means collegial self-governments, curriculum committees, reviewing for journals, sitting on Senate, sitting on boards of governors, and the rest, this kind of work does not get factored in. We know from a lot of evidence that minorities, originally women, but now increasingly Indigenous colleagues and others, do a disproportionate amount of service work, and yet the institutional reward structure doesn't recognize these fairly. So I think one of the things we need to do to recognize excellence, and this is to pick up Tina's point, is to recognize excellence in all the domains of faculty work. So that 40-40-20 that I gave you is a tenure track colleagues workload. In a teaching stream, it might be 80-20, teaching research. But the point will be that this work is often disproportionately unfairly distributed. And these mechanisms to fully assess the workload aren't always very well done. It's why at my university, for example, we can see, despite everything, a year and a half, 18 months separates promotion to full professor rates for women and for men. And that at year 12, women are 15.5% less likely than men to be full professors, perhaps because the excellence in their comprehensive workload is not recognized in the way that it might be for other colleagues.
Thank you so much. We are now on to our 5-minute round of questions, leading off with MP Lobb for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. My first question is for Professor Prentice. What, like at the University of Manitoba, what has what's the HR department say to you when you present your complaints? Like when the professors say it's not fair, 40-40-20, do they not say anything back to you, or what's their point?
Sorry, I've personally never had to deal with the HR department. Most of the time when we discuss our workload, we're dealing with a department head or a dean or perhaps a vice provost. The larger, I guess, question I'm asking universities to do more carefully is to monitor workloads, to recognize that some colleagues do different kinds of work. My Indigenous colleagues, for example, spend an enormous amount of time mentoring Indigenous students at the University of Manitoba. This is absolutely critical to student success. If they spend more time in teaching and more time mentoring, but they perhaps publish less, are they doing a less good job?
Fair enough, but what's HR like? There's thousands of these administration people that work at universities, and what are they doing? Like, I look at it and I say, what's HR doing? They should be right in there and talking to the deans and everybody else and saying this isn't right. Let's get it fixed. Is that not happening?
I think my colleague is trying to weigh in on this.
Okay, let's go.
Well, I think in an academic setting, this is where we need to think about the different responsibilities. So here at the University of Manitoba, like many other places, the responsibilities for overseeing this comes through the provost's office. And I would say here at the University of Manitoba, there's a lot of work that is being done. So whether it's around setting new guidelines for hiring, and I think, this is very similar to what Professor Boone just was speaking about as well at the University of Toronto. So ensuring that equity-based approaches are part of our hiring processes, that we're having and entering into those discussions about what are appropriate workloads amongst people. Ultimately, it's the Provost's office that begins to monitor that deans report to on what's happening. I think what we're really addressing in terms of systemic inequities at the universities now is how do we shift the culture so that the different departments, the units, those who are doing the hiring are creating the kinds of cultures that support equity. So I don't think we're really at the moment of can we hire those who are systemically marginalized and underrepresented? We can hire them. Are we going to allow them to thrive?
What's HR do? Is there an HR department at the University of Manitoba?
Human Resources oversees a lot of the staff appointments. They are doing the work in terms of addressing systemic inequities for staff, but faculty hiring actually happens through the Provost's office, and that's where the monitoring happens.
The dean, what's the dean or the chancellor of the school doing then? Shouldn't that individual take charge and say, we got to fix the system here? Let's get it.
I think this is... Yes, definitely. We at the universities, we see this happening at all levels. So for me, I work in the Provost's office and I oversee the equity strategies. The Provost messages them. We work with the deans for constant education, for monitoring. And so what you want to see is a kind of a way of reporting and bringing everyone together at all the levels. Some units are more successful. So as people have talked, it's a bit of a, carrot and stick about where that's happening. But on its own, as we sort of unfold those, we're working in collaboration. But what one has to do is also make sure that you're creating the spaces institutionally, but also nationally about what the expectations are, because it's very hard for any unit or faculty member to say, well, my job is to prioritize this type of work. I'm really invested in community-based work, teaching, but I can't get a national grant because they don't recognize it.
I'm just a regular guy, I'm from a small town, and I look at this and I'm like, it's obvious. The problem here is obvious. You've got deans and they don't report to HR, and we don't know what the president of the university is doing, and it's all right in front of their face. So I got to help me here on this, because I see it, and I'm the problem, how HR can't work with the departments to set it up and make it right, and how the board of directors of the university, and I'm not just picking on the University of Manitoba, it's almost like it's an abdication of the responsibility, and you've got all these professors trying to get a fair deal, and administrations, it seems to me like they're doing nothing. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
I would actually just say I do believe you're wrong on that.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of work that's being done, but we are working and dealing with what are, centuries of institutional sexism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, racism. They're embedded in how we work and how we value people's work. And so when that becomes embedded in a system, it's not simply one person saying, oh, we should pay you better, because all of our ways in which society also values particular work, where it thinks that lays, where we think appropriate bodies are placed and whose bodies have value become part of our institutions. So it's not simply it's not a lack of reporting and accountability, but it's actually requires an entire cognitive shift in how we see the world. So, I'm mindful when I enter any room, are there in fact people who are from racially marginalized groups present and being given voice to speak? So how often are we hearing those voices? How often are we hearing the voices of the non-binary people speaking about the inequities, or people simply asking us and saying, how come you can't solve the problem? And I think this is where we have to think about the systemic issues that are at site, and also understanding that in a university, it is in fact the deans. There are numerous levels of reporting, but as we build those cultures, we have to also be valuing. So it's not just what you pay and how much you sort of.
Thank you so much for that. We're a minute over. We're going to be moving on to MP Dab for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. And professors, thank you to all of you for coming and giving us testimony. Ms. Chen, I very much was learning a lot from your testimony, very much appreciate the candid responses that you are giving. We're studying gap in this particular field, but I'd say they probably exist in so many fields across our society. I have a question for Professor Boone. I was very excited to hear of your study, and I can't wait for 2024 when you release the statistics that you're talking about. You talked about the two streams and tenure and teaching, and how there was very minimal differences and no difference actually in the teaching between the two. What I'm wondering is, do you account for part-time faculty, faculty on contracts, librarians, clinical faculty? And before you answer that, I'm also wondering, you've now said you've instituted a hiring process where about 50% are women. I guess, when was that instituted, and what do you currently have in terms of percentages between the two genders, or the different genders, I guess, in the university, just to see whether the statistics that you have sort of looked into, that there was no statistical or not minimal statistical differences, does that represent sort of a fair percentage of the gender?
Right. So we have these results publicly available, and we refresh them annually. I don't know the exact amounts, but we are very close to gender parity in both our assistant professor and our associate professor ranks. In the full professor, or the professor rank, which is the senior scientists, we have more men than women, and that's legacy hiring that was done more than 15 years ago. And so it will take a while before we reach parity at that level. We haven't instituted a rule that we have to hire 50% women. What we have done is spent a lot of time asking people to think deeply, talking about that culture that Susan and Tina were mentioning. How do we value people's careers and trajectories? How do we value the things that they have done? What does excellence look like? And ensuring that we are taking a broad perspective of that, thinking about people that may have non-traditional career paths, for example, those kinds of things, and doing a very deliberate attempt to encourage people with diverse backgrounds to apply for our ads. And lo and behold, when you have a diverse applicant pool and you think broadly about what excellence looks like, you hire approximately 50% men and women, and other diverse candidates as well. And so
got another question for you, though. Well, with the couple of minutes we have, we know that the pandemic has significantly affected, I would say, more women in the workplace, particularly those that have small children. I guess, how do you account for that, and the fact that women do have babies? That's a fact of life, and when they do take time off. How do you account for that in your university setting, with respect to promotion, with respect to sort of tenure, with the issues that we're talking about?
Right. So we have very generous leaves for women, because you're absolutely right. And when a woman takes a leave, their tenure clock stops. So in the university, you have a maximum number of years. In most university, you go up in your 6th year for this tenure review. And so when someone is on leave, we stop the clock so that that year doesn't count. And many women and men take more than one leave. We also try to normalize leaves. People take leaves for all kinds of reasons. It can be for child rearing, it can be for illness, and reminding our colleagues when someone does come up for tenure that no, they didn't get 8 years and therefore should have more publications. They had the same number of years of active career work as everyone else. So it's again normalizing that many people take leaves. Yes, women do take more, but about 25% or so, that's a rough estimate, of our faculty have taken at least 1 year of leave and stopped the tenure clock when they go up for tenure. And we remind colleagues of that.
So Professor Chen, how do you deal with it in the University of Manitoba?
I would say our policies are quite similar to what Heather said, and particularly it's part of our collective agreement with the union so that we have a very well laid out process. I think the normalizing of leaves is a key part to that. And I think this is where you mentioned earlier about asking whether it's full-time. I think this is where we see the difference in types of experiences. So while we can normalize leaves and we can think about support for people who are taking leaves for a variety of reasons, here at the University of Manitoba, We're also very concerned about particularly Indigenous faculty and those who are in ceremony, different types of childcare and family responsibilities, and the way that shapes their lives. But really where we don't have a similar type of way of addressing the inequities or the ways that people's personal lives impact on the workplace and how COVID has exacerbated some of that really comes with the precariat, with the part-time instructors, and those inequities are indeed getting bigger. The evidence isn't fully there, but we all know what's happening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. And now we're going to be on our final round. We're going to do a minute apiece. First up from the block is MP Blanchette-Jones.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On va y aller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick. My question will be for Ms. Prentice. Earlier, I asked you what the federal government can do in its programs and its requirements. I'd like to ask you the opposite question. What can universities, provinces, and Quebec not do to ensure pay equity themselves for their professors? What do they need the federal government to do?
Thank you. I appreciate posing the question backwards. I think that's an intriguing way to go. It's very clear that universities are employers, but maybe I'll take this last minute to also say that they're also teachers. And one of the groups we haven't talked very much about right now will be our graduate student cohort. One of the immediate things the federal government could do, for example, would be to ensure that a student receiving a stipend, a tri-council stipend for graduate studies, if they take a parental leave, a man or a woman, whether they take 6, 12, or 18 months, that they continue to be paid during that leave. Because while a professor will get pay, a graduate student might get time, but no money. There's one thing that could come federally.
Thank you so much for that. Now on to the NDP. We're going to have MP Johns for 1 minute.
Mr. Chair, could I ask Ms. Chan and Ms. Boone if they could answer in writing for my last question? That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Absolutely. MP Johns, the floor is yours for 1 minute.
On May 1st, the people behind Canada's scientific research walked off the job. Thousands of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows from 49 universities and scientific institutions were protesting the lack of a wage increase in 20 years. Not only does the low real value of Canada's graduate scholarships and fellowships force our best and brightest to live in poverty, but it causes harm. Could you expand on how this underfunding impacts academic pay inequity? And I'll maybe go back to you, Ms. Prentice.
Thank you. It's true. We expect graduate students to spend years, 2 years for a master's degree, and between 4 and 6 or more years as a PhD student in order to get the highest academic qualifications. And we pay them shamefully. And so this means families without money that can't supplement, people without partners, people who are already disadvantaged, people whose living costs are higher, perhaps because they have children or additional costs, they are disadvantaged. And so increasing the stipends that we pay to the best and the brightest who are on their way to graduate degrees is a very important step.
Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here and the questions from the MPs. We now, right on time, we're going to adjourn. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Meeting is adjourned.